Six men trained by the most powerful intelligence organization in the world, holders of highly sensitive secrets, and suddenly they vanish without a trace. No alarm, no kidnapping, no mission. Instead, they turn up thousands of kilometers away, convinced they must kill the Antichrist, because a mysterious entity called Sapphire ordered them to. What exactly happened in the days that no one but themselves knows about? Why were they not punished afterward but honorably discharged? This is the story of the Gulf Breeze 6, a mystery that left many questions open. Welcome to the Gulf Breeze 6 case. Who were these men and what drove them to leave everything behind? To understand that, we need to go back to Germany, to the city of Augsburg. That's where the 701st Military Intelligence Brigade was stationed. It worked closely with the NSA, and in Augsburg, the agency operated what was, at the time, the largest listening facility outside of the United States. There were 6 soldiers there, not just any group, but men who worked directly for the NSA. Every single one of them possessed the highest security clearance, privy to project information that ordinary citizens would never even hear about. Highly qualified, strictly vetted, psychologically screened, exactly the kind of people you would expect to be firmly grounded and not easily drawn off tracks. And yet something happened that no one could have anticipated. One day these 6 soldiers left their base without permission. No prior signal, no warning, simply vanished. Later they claimed that the trigger had been a session with a Ouija board. During that session, they said, they made contact with a being that called itself Sapphire. And this being is said to have given them a mission, not a small one, but the supposed order to kill the Antichrist. Sapphire also had revealed to them a series of dark prophecies, visions of coming events that sounded anything but hopeful. But as ominous as the future was described, Sapphire had assured them at the same time that they 6 would ultimately be the ones to guide the world back into its rightful path. That is the core of this strange case. 6 NSA agents, highly trained and repeatedly tested psychologically, people who should be resistant to any form of irrational influence, and yet something like this happened. An incident that raises far more questions than it answers. What must be also considered in this context is the magnitude of their decision. All 6 men were fully aware that there would be no turning back. They knew that with a single step they were putting everything at risk. Their careers, their income, their safety, their entire previous lives. As holders of the highest security clearance, leaving the base without authorization was not just a minor offense, it was criminal and extraordinarily dangerous. Their heads were filled with information critical to national security. Exactly this initially caused a significant concern. After all, we are in the middle of the Cold War. At the NSA, they initially assumed that the man might have been kidnapped by Soviet agents. The idea that 6 highly sensitive secret holders could have fallen into enemy hands set off every alarm within the agencies. But soon it turned out, almost by accident, that most of these fears were false. The soldiers were not abroad, not in some enemy interrogation room, but in the USA, in a small town called Gulf Breeze. They claimed that the Antichrist would be born right there, or was already living there, the very entity they insisted they were meant to kill. But this necessarily raises the question, what had actually happened there? Officially, both the NSA and the Army firmly deny any connection to their own operations. No experiments, no programs, no tests. That is the official line. Everything pure coincidence, everything merely the private action of these 6 men, nothing more. The Gulf Breeze 6, as they were later called however, described the situation completely differently. According to their account, they had taken part in a secret project, in which methods such as pendulum dowsing, tarot cards or other forms of supposed extrasensory perception were examined, with the goal of finding out whether such practice could perhaps be used for military purposes. As part of these tests, they said the Ouija board was also used. The NSA and the military categorically denied all of this. None of it fell within their responsibilities, they declared, and no such experiment had ever been authorized. According to the official version, the claim was simply absurd. And right between these contradictory accounts and this tension between secrecy, public denial, and the statement of the 6 men, the mystery truly begins. According to the official version, the 6 soldiers had undertaken all of this entirely on their own, without orders, without authorization, without any connection to their actual duties. A small part of that claim may even be true, because the men did not only engage with the Ouija board during the alleged test program, but also afterwards in their free time, outside of any regular activity. But when you look more closely at the course of events, a different picture emerges. In the case I'm about to tell you, it quickly becomes clear that the military was by no means as uninterested as it later claimed. Another point raises additional questions. How was it even possible that no one knew that the six were still inside the United States? Because according to the book that was later published about this case, there were already clear regulations in place at the time. With every entry or exit of NSA personnel, a notification to the agency had to be automatically triggered, at the very latest at an airport, with security checks, passport data comparison, and corresponding indicators of their status. It should have been clear that these were NSA agents. In such cases, an alert would have been triggered immediately. With these six, that apparently did not happen. Why not? Who failed? Or was something perhaps intentionally overlooked? And that's exactly what is so strange. Even though it was a completely automated process, not a single notification about the entry of these six agents into the United States was triggered. Nothing. No hint, no alarm, no record of their arrival. And this leaves the obvious question hanging in the air. Why not? Who disabled this automatic system? Or who prevented the information from reaching the responsible officers at all? The fact that these six soldiers were eventually found was pure coincidence. After arriving in the US, they first traveled to Chattanooga, a city in the state of Tennessee. There they bought an old VW bus, simple, practical and unassuming. With the vehicle, all six then set out together for Gulf Breeze, their alleged destination. And it was precisely there, in the middle of an ordinary street, that they were stopped by a police patrol. No major incident, no target operation, simply a broken taillight that made the officers suspicious. During the routine check of the driver license of the man at the wheel, the police finally came across something no one had expected. The driver was wanted for an unauthorized absence from the military. Because by that time the NSA and the army had already launched a worldwide international search alert, they still assumed that the six soldiers might have been kidnapped by a hostile power, a scenario that certainly did not seem far-fetched in the context of the Cold War. But in the end, it wasn't enemy agents, not secret operations and not some grand intervention that brought the truth to light. It was a broken taillight on a VW bus. The search message stored in the system did not officially mention a possible kidnapping, but it clearly indicated that the soldier had left his unit without permission. This information appeared in the police database, and that was enough to arrest the driver on the spot. The remaining 5 men, however, were initially allowed to go. For the officers, they were at that moment nothing more than passengers. Only at the station did the officer realize the magnitude of the incident. They discovered that not only the driver was wanted, but the 5 additional soldiers had also been reported as absent without leave. An officer's search notice for the remaining men was issued immediately. When the VW bus was found shortly afterward, the remaining 5 could also be arrested. The group was then separated and taken to Fort Benning, a large military base not far from Gulf Breeze. There, all 6 men were locked up individually, strictly separated from each other, with no possibility of communication. Even the driver, who had initially been in police custody, was transferred there and likewise placed in isolation. It was the moment when the military machinery fully kicked in, and when a strange incident became a case of national interest. However, the police made a fateful mistake. In their daily report to the press, they mentioned that 1 soldier had initially been arrested, and shortly afterward 5 more because they had left the unit without authorization. Had this not happened, the case would likely never have come to light. In the meantime, the NSA had already issued strict instructions. No one was allowed to speak about the arrests. No one was allowed to question the soldiers, neither about their activities nor about their stay in Gulf Breeze. But in truth, this was no longer necessary, because the arrested driver of the VW bus had already revealed a little at the police station. Soon the press began making inquiries. Where had the soldiers been absent without leave? What drove them to Gulf Breeze? The police eventually gave a surprising answer. Allegedly, the man wanted to kill the Antichrist. A magazine picked up the story, Soldiers of Fortune. There are many magazines of this kind in the US, but this one, now more than 40 years old, is particularly well known. It is not an official military magazine, but glorifies the soldier's life, the glory of battle, the toughness in combat, risk and willingness to sacrifice. And it was precisely this publication that reported on the unusual events surrounding the 6 NSA agents. For the press, deserted soldiers were of course a perfect headline, but a story like this was beyond anything they expected. Headlines about the Gulf Breeze 6 appeared and brought the events fully into the public eye. Meanwhile, the families of the 6 soldiers had contacted the army and the NSA to find out what happened to their sons. They were told that the men were in solitary confinement in Gulf Breeze. Armed with this information, the parents went to the press. The soldiers were between 19 and 25 years old at the time. Their parents were understandably deeply worried and hoped to use the media to apply pressure so that their sons would not be left to rot in isolation. As a result, the press offices of the army and the NSA were flooded with inquiries. What is really happening with these 6 men? A spokesperson for the army finally stated that the men were not quite normal anymore and belonged to a cult, an end-time cult called the End of the World. With that, the topic was officially considered resolved for the public. The only problem was that it quickly turned out this cult did not exist at all. Under the pressure from the worried parents, 2 senators stepped in, Cashman and Dowley. They met with representatives of the NSA and the military, and from that moment on, everything unfolded very quickly and at the same time extremely strangely. Only 3 weeks after the meeting between the senators and the authorities, the 6 soldiers were already standing before a military court. We are talking here about holders of the highest level of classified information, who had abandoned their unit without authorization, an offense that is normally punished severely. So the eyes of everyone present grew wide when the sentence was announced. There was none. The 6 soldiers were indeed demoted, but afterward they were released from the army with full honors and even received half a month's salary on top of that. This verdict was extraordinary in every aspect. NSA and military personnel with access to highly classified information do not simply walk away unpunished after abandoning their unit. An honorable discharge and additional pay are virtually unheard of. The fact that it happened here is almost without precedent. The question remains, was there compensation for the surprisingly mild judgment? Whether yes or no is still not truly known. Some suspect that the soldiers had to keep quiet about their supposed involvement in an experiment unit, something along the lines of MKUltra. The Gulf Breeze 6, however, have always vehemently denied this. They insist that no experiments were ever conducted on them, that MKUltra was not used on them, and that no drugs were involved. To this day they maintain everything they said is true. One example, during the arrest of the 5 remaining soldiers after the VW bus was found, a bookstore played a role. This bookstore was owned by a psychologist and was an esoteric shop, according to the Gulf Breeze 6. However, it had nothing to do with the events. They merely knew the woman who worked there and had sought refuge there at time. The location is also interesting. Gulf Breeze was at that time one of the UFO hotspots in the United States, which made the entire story appear even more mysterious. At that time, there were a large number of unusual sightings in Gulf Breeze, another factor that magnified the events like a burning glass. The 6 soldiers arrived there during exactly this period, yet they later insisted that these UFO reports had nothing to do with their own story. But now we approach the decisive questions. How did it come to this in the first place? Why did 6 highly qualified soldiers, men who had undergone strict psychological testing in order to be transferred to the NSA, who possessed the highest security clearance, and who were trained as fully fledged intelligence personnel, leave their unit merely because they were convinced they were in contact with a spirit being? The answer to these questions comes from the Gulf Breeze 6 themselves. One of them, Vince Davis, later recorded his experience in a book. According to them, it all began with an apparently harmless experiment. The group had used a Ouija board. During this session, they reported a being made contact that called itself Sapphire. This Sapphire began making predictions about global events. At first, the young men did not take these messages very seriously, but that changed suddenly when, so they claimed, the first prophecy came true. A severe earthquake in Iran in 1990, which Sapphire had allegedly announced beforehand. From that moment on, they were convinced they were indeed in a contact with an otherworldly being that knew future events, and even more, that gave them specific orders. What to swear and what further prophecy Sapphire supposedly made appeared in their accounts only later. Sapphire instructed them, among other things, that they should convey God's words, and that their loyalty to God was more important than any loyalty to an army or an intelligence service. Everything would be fine, the being assured them. In addition, they were told to go to Gulf Breeze, where they were to await the birth or arrival of the Antichrist and then kill him. Who exactly the Antichrist would be was to be revealed to them at the appropriate time. The arrival of the Antichrist was predicted for the year 1998. At this point, one detail is crucial to understanding the entire story. The Gulf Breeze 6 kept a detailed Ouija board protocol during all their sessions with Sapphire. Word for word, they wrote down everything they had been told by the spirit being. At the time of their arrest, they handed these documents over to both NSA and the army. Later, the documents, including the hearing records and the statement of the Gulf Breeze 6, were requested under the Freedom of Information Act in the United States. But when the files were released, 1,400 pages were missing. The original report had comprised about 1,600 pages, yet only about 200 pages reached the public. Everything else remained classified. Above all the alleged prophecies that the Gulf Breeze 6 claimed to have received from the being called Sapphire no longer appeared in the released files. To this day, the military makes every effort to portray the group as confused, delusional, or even mentally unstable. And indeed, there are statements from the six soldiers that may appear strange to anyone who has never dealt with such topics. For example, the man reported that in the context of a top-secret NSA project, they were informed that large parts of widely accepted world history were incorrect. Anyone familiar with historical anomalies knows that there are now within academic research legitimate discussions about reassessing certain chapters of recorded history, simply because archaeological findings no longer fit the established narrative. But the Gulf Breeze 6 went far beyond that. They claimed specifically that even the founding history of the United States didn't match the official account. A revelation, if true, could deliver a serious blow to American national pride. For exactly this reason, they believed there was an effort to discredit their statement entirely and label the six men as lunatics. Furthermore, they claimed that during their work they had received information about actual contacts between otherworldly life forms and the US government, more precisely the NSA. According to their statement of the Gulf Breeze 6, even the alien visitors whose existence they believed in were said to have their own extensive history on Earth, a history that, according to them, had been systematically concealed by governments and official historians. Whether that is true or not, for the six men it remained a central pillar of their worldview. Among the many notes that the Gulf Breeze 6 said they received from Sapphire was also a series of prophecies that, at least at first glance, seem astonishingly concrete. One of them stated that all borders in Europe would fall, without giving a time frame. Another described an impending war between the United States and Iraq. If Israel were to interfere in this conflict, it was said the use of nuclear weapons would be unavoidable. But if Israel stayed out, the war would end exactly after 45 days. Many retrospective interpretations see in this a striking parallel to the First Gulf War, which indeed ended in a remarkably short time. Even more drastic were the passages describing the downfall of New York, triggered by a man-made catastrophe. Some readers in later years interpreted this reference as a hint toward a gas explosion, perhaps even damage caused by fracking. Others, however, saw in the mentioned huge explosion a veiled reference to the attacks of September 11. None of this is clear, but the way such prophecies are praised often leaves plenty of room for interpretation and projection. Other statements seemed less cryptic. The United States, it said, was destined to come under military rule. The border to Mexico and Canada would be closed, and a comprehensive no-fly zone established. The documents also included the vision of a downed aircraft, 302 fatalities included. Taken together, these individual fragments painted a picture of a sweeping collapse of the order as we know it. And in the center of this collapse, the six soldiers believed their task would begin, to rebuild civilization, just as Sapphire had instructed them. Even the Vatican appeared in these notes. It was said to be destined to publish historical documents in the future. Documents that would overshadow everything known so far. Records that would shake history, religion, and humanity's self-understanding alike. In the end, the question remains, what is one supposed to make of all of this? Was the entire affair merely the product of a shared self-deception, an elaborate mental construct created by six young men, barely between 19 and 25, to which they still feel bound today? Or does something else lie beneath it? Something that reaches beyond imagination, the psychological aftershocks of a Ouija experiment that's spun out of control? Some point out that at least a few of their claims bear faint similarities to later events. Others, however, view the missing NSA files as the strongest indication that the authorities had something to hide. If you enjoyed the video, I would really appreciate a comment, like and subscription. If you would like to see another interesting case, feel free to check out my previous video about Marconi, in which 25 employed scientists at the company died under bizarre and mysterious circumstances. See you next time.